inshallah. Brothers, if you can come a bit closer, that'll make my life easier. Sisters, can you hear? Are you good? All right, awesome. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Kids, if I could, it's interesting. If you look at the lives of the Sahaba as well, and many converts nowadays, there's different things that bring people to Islam. Some of them it's the Quran, some of them it's other Muslims. For me, it was the life of the Prophet. I came across a book which talked about the Prophet's life, and that attracted me to Islam, or at least got me interested in researching into Islam. And since then, I've always been reading Seerahs and trying to learn from Seerahs. But before we actually think of the Seerah as a lesson or a class, it's better to think the Seerah as a journey. And the reason for that is twofold. One is the very word Seerah. Okay? The root word of Seerah and Sirat. You know, in Surah Fatiha, Sirat al-Mustaqim, the path. It's the same root word. It's the path or the journey. The best description is a journey. So when we say the Seerah of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, we're talking about the journey of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So the best way to approach that journey is to be on that journey with him. To try and go back in time and walk through those paths that he did, to walk on the same paths that the Sahaba did. Now, you can see a couple of books here. When we go through the Seerah, inshallah, on a weekly basis, I'll try to refer to some of these books, but the main book that I'll be using is this particular one called Revelations. And I'll talk a bit about this book, but before I do, we need to understand where the early sources of Seerah came from. In the very, very early days, if we go all the way back to the time of the Sahaba, there was no one single book called the Seerah. It was a compilation of hadith. There were Sahaba like Sahal ibn Abi Hatam, who was a very young Sahaba at the time the Prophet ﷺ was alive. He wrote quite a few hadiths on the Prophet ﷺ and parts of his life. There was Abdullah ibn Abbas, and then another young Sahaba by the name of Sa'd ibn Ubadah al-Khari. Now these Sahaba and many others kept record of the Prophet ﷺ's life. These records were then later over the years slowly compiled by certain scholars, right? So there was the main scholar was Urwa ibn al-Zubair. Urwa ibn al-Zubair lived during the time of the Umayyad Caliph. And what he did was he wrote in response to questions that the Caliph had from him. So for example, the Caliph would ask him and ask questions about what did the Prophet do in this instance and what did the Prophet do in that instance. And this scholar Urwa would respond in a narrative format, in a story format. So we're starting to see the very early stages of the Seerah coming about. Later, there was a scholar by the name of Musa ibn Uqba. Musa ibn Uqba created a little handbook for his students. This was like pretty much notes, handwritten notes for his students to understand the Seerah. This is the very, very early stages now. We've got the very, very early stages of a Seerah being formed, the handwritten notes. But the very first collected comprehensive biography of the Prophet ﷺ was by a sheikh by the name of Muhammad ibn Ishaq. Now, from these names, if you want to remember any name, I recommend this one name, Muhammad ibn Ishaq. Muhammad ibn Ishaq was the scholar who created the first or drafted the first Seerah in one book, in one note. And then, of course, we have Seerah al-Nabawiyya by Ibn Kathir. That's very famous, and a lot of the modern scholars use that as a source book to write the Seerahs. Now, these are all technical stuff. We're not going to go too much into this. This is just so you have an idea of where the source is. What we want to do is go back in time. We want to go back in time 1,452 years approximately. And to go back in time, it's important for us to understand what time machines we're using. Let's use that word. These books, these Seerahs, these are the time machines we use. Now, in the particular book that I'm using, this one, which is the main one, was written by a person, Dr. Miraj Mohieddin. Dr. Miraj is a doctor, a medical doctor. And it's very interesting how he wrote this book. He struggled with the idea of how is it that some people are moved to tears when they hear the Quran, but for me, as a non-speaking Arab, I can't feel that emotion. Yes, he respected the Quran as a Muslim, and he was a practicing Muslim, and he loved it, but he couldn't connect. And he couldn't understand why. So he had one option he had was to learn the Arabic language and try to learn it as a native speaker, which is hard when you're an adult. The other option he thought is, what if I put myself in the position of the Sahaba and tried to understand the life that the Sahaba were living when these revelations were revealed? Inshallah, that's what we're going to try and do. We're going to try and go back in time and live in the footsteps of the Sahaba as the revelations were coming, as the Prophet ﷺ was living and going through his journey in his life in this dunya. Now, he used several different scholars. He used scholars like Safur Rahman al-Mubarakpuri, who is the author of Sealed Nectar. Martin Ling is a famous Seerah author. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf's Life of the Prophet, Adil Salahi's Muhammad, Man and the Prophet. But he also then touched on Western academics. People like William Montgomery Watt, Karen Armstrong. So he tried to bring a holistic picture of the Prophet ﷺ's life. So this is all the dry stuff, right? We've finished with the dry stuff. I've given you kind of an idea of the resources we're using. Now we're going to try and go back in time and live the life that the Prophet ﷺ lived. Now like I said, what I'm going to do is not a class. I've got a few slides, but those slides are just maps really that I'll bring up. So it's not a class. I'm not a scholar, so I'm not in a position to give a class either. It's not just a story. It's a journey that we're going to try to take to bring to life this man whose name was Muhammad, who was a Prophet ﷺ. But we're going to see him as a man, as a father, as a husband, as a soldier, as a leader, as a friend. And all these characteristics of the Prophet ﷺ we're going to try and bring to life and bring it into our own lives. And the best place to start is with a description of his appearance. This is a famous description that was narrated by Ali. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, when I read this description, to try and bring it into your mind. As humans, it's very natural for us to try and imagine a person, or bring into mind in our mind's eye this image of the person. And it's a bit hard actually in Islam because we don't have any images, we don't have pictures of him. What we do have though is this rich treasure trove of hadiths that have been compiled and checked and cross-checked. And it is through these hadiths that we can get an image of the Prophet ﷺ. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you a famous description of the Prophet. And if you would like, close your eyes and try and bring to mind who this person is from this description. And hold that image in your mind as we go through this journey. And at key points in the seerah, I'll try and read this description again. All right. Abdullah ibn al-Harith narrated this. He said, I never saw a person who smiled more than the Messenger of Allah. And Ali says, Ibrahim ibn Muhammad reported that whenever Ali used to describe the Prophet ﷺ, he would say, and this is the description that Ali would narrate, he'd say, the Messenger of Allah was neither very tall nor very short, but of a medium stature amongst the people. His hair was neither very curly nor completely straight. Rather, it was between these two descriptions. He did not have a fleshy body or a fully round face. His face was slightly round. His skin color was white with some redness. He had extremely black eyes with long eyelashes. He had large joints and broad shoulders. There was no hair more than normal on his body, and he had a thin line of hair running from the chest to the navel. He had thick hands and feet. When he walked, he lifted his legs with vigor, and his steps were firm and strong as if he was descending down a slope. When he wished to look behind, he would turn his whole body and not just the face. The seal of prophethood was situated between his shoulders. He was the seal of prophets. He had the most generous of hearts and the most truthful of tongue. He was the most kind-hearted and tolerant person ever. He was the best to spend time with due to his awe-inspiring character and kind treatment. Anyone who came across him unexpectedly would become awestruck, and whoever came in close contact with him would love him. One who describes him can only state, I have never seen anyone comparable to him. I don't know if there is a way of giving a description of a person you love more affectionately than that. I honestly don't know. This description shows two things. The love that the Prophet ﷺ gave his companions and the love that the companions had towards him. I mean, I ask you guys, if you can, think of the person you love the most, your parents, your child, whoever. Can you give a more affectionate description of that person? So hold this description in your mind as we go on this journey. But this week, we're not going to see the Prophet ﷺ. This week, not yet. Because we're going to go back in time even further than 1,452 years. We're going to go even further back. Because we need to understand the environment that this Prophet ﷺ was born to. We need to understand the culture. We need to understand the environment, the geography of this region. So we're going to start with understanding the history of the Arabs. Now this is going to be a bit interesting because we all think we know the history of the Arabs, yeah? Descendant of Prophet Ismail alayhi salam. Yes, but not quite. During the Prophet's time, there was a view that there was three groups of Arabs. Now bear with me, you're going to understand why I'm saying this as we go along. But during the Prophet's time, there was a view there's three groups of Arabs. The first group was known as the perished Arabs. A bit of a hard word, perished, or the Arabs who were destroyed. This is in reference to Thamud and Ad. Now the perished Arabs, the scholars say, were descendants of Nuh alayhi salam, and these were the tribes of Ad that Prophet Hud was sent to, and they were destroyed by the wind. We know the story of this. And the Thamud were the people that Prophet Sabah thunderbolt, or a large thunderstrike. To give you an idea of where they're situated, you can see on the TV right there. Thamud was situated north in the Arabian Peninsula, and Ad was further south in the Arabian Peninsula. Ad was located between Yemen and Oman, and Thamud in the northern area known as Mada in Sada. Here's an interesting fact. The ruins of Thamud actually can still be seen today. And there's also a narration where when the Prophet ﷺ was marching to Tabuk with his Sahaba, he actually told his Sahaba not to stop. We need to march and make haste so that we pass these ruins. He didn't like the ruins. He was not comfortable around these ruins because this was the place where these Arabs, these perished Arabs, lived and were destroyed for their disobedience of Allah. So this is the first group. Now, we know in the Quran that there's many references to Thamud and the Ad, so I'm not going to go into that. But the second group is known by a term, the pure Arabs. The tribes during the Prophet ﷺ's time would refer to them as the pure Arabs. The pure Arabs settled in a region in Yemen, and they founded the empire of Sheba. Does that ring a bell? The empire of Sheba, does that ring a bell? It should, when you think of the story of Prophet Sulaiman. The queen of Sheba, and a lot of Arab texts refer to her as Queen Bilqis, is mentioned in Surah An-Naml in chapter 27, verse 22 to 24, in the story of the prophets. So we know this story. Remember the story where Sheba met Prophet Sulaiman and Prophet Sulaiman instructed jinns to go and bring the throne from Sheba? Well, that's the region. You can see here, Jerusalem, right at the top, that was where Prophet Sulaiman was reigning in. He was the king. And Sheba was all the way down south in Yemen. These were known as the pure Arabs. Now, over time, Sheba, the empire of Sheba deteriorated, and it split into two tribes. One was known as Himyar and the other known as Kahlan. These two tribes fought amongst each other, and Himyar won, forcing the Kahlan tribe to move north to the rest of the Arabian Peninsula. So you see that. As the Kahlan tribe started moving north, they split into smaller tribes, and they started spreading in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, these pure Arabs, or this tribe of Kahlan, when they started splitting, they started becoming all the little tribes that we may know nowadays. So there was the Aus and Khazraj, we all know that name. They settled in Medina, or at that time Yathrib. These were descendants of the Khahlan tribe who were leaving the Empire of Sheba. Does everyone follow me? Is everyone all right with that so far? They weren't descendants of Ishmael at the time. So that's an interesting fact. The pure Arabs weren't descendants of Prophet Ishmael alayhi salam. The group that was the descendants of Prophet Ishmael alayhi salam was known as the Arabized Arabs. The Arabized Arabs. The Prophet Ishmael's story is a very interesting one. We know this story, right, of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was, most scholars believe, was born in the city of Ur. And you can see right there where the city of Ur is, near the Euphrates River. He was born into a family that was very strong in the belief of polytheism. But it didn't sit well with Prophet Ibrahim. Something was wrong, something was not right. And we know the story, so I'm not going to go into great depth of this story. He questioned and he asked questions about who is Allah. And, you know, with the story of being thrown in the fire and all that, after that he left Ur. He could no longer stay. He left Ur with his wife Sarah and his nephew Lut. And they traveled to Canaan, and from Canaan, so Canaan is the region where modern day Israel is. They traveled to Canaan, and from Canaan they went into Egypt. And Egypt, now scholars believe that in Egypt, this is where Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam met Hajar. There is a biblical view that Hajar was a slave that was given to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, but there's an Islamic view that some scholars hold that she was actually not a slave, but it was a second wife given to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam by the Pharaoh. We won't go into the details of this story, but what happens is that Hajar marries Prophet Ibrahim, and they have the son, Prophet Ishmael alayhi salam. At the time that Prophet Ibrahim has his son, Prophet Ishmael, he's very old. And so this child that's born is of a great blessing to him, because they've been praying for a child and they've given up. But Allah gives him this son, and not only is it a son, but he becomes a prophet. Now, at one point, Allah instructs Ibrahim alayhi salam to take Hajar and Prophet Ishmael and to head south. Now, at this time, from the region of Jerusalem, they head south. Now, at this time, the southern region of the Arabian Peninsula is pretty much a wilderness. There's nothing there. There's a few tribes that are living dispersed from the Khahlan tribe that left Sheba. They're living in that desert region, but it's not a trade route. There's nothing important in that region. And so when this instruction is given to Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam to take his wife and his young son, in Ibrahim's mind, it is almost a death sentence. A lot of the times when I'm reading the Seerah or learning about the prophets, and you hear the hardships that the prophets experience, you think, well, yeah, it's pretty bad, but they were prophets. You know, I'm sure it's fine. They were talking to Allah, they were getting messages from Allah. It couldn't be that bad if you're a prophet. And I'm being honest, this is how I think. I don't know if that's crossed your mind. And that is true. They were more than any of us. But the reality is they were also humans. They were also fathers. They were also husbands. So try and put yourself in the shoes of Prophet Ibrahim. It wasn't like Allah told him, you know, go take them down and don't worry, I'm going to look after them. And then from Ishmael, there's going to be this great nation and there's going to be a lot of lessons. This was not what happened. He was just told, take Hajar, take Ishmael, go into the wilderness and leave them. And he did. Now, when they were going into the wilderness, Hajar asks a question from Prophet Ibrahim. I'm trying to get the exact quote, but I'll tell you roughly what she said. She said, "Did Allah tell you to leave us? Why are you doing this? Did Allah tell you to leave us?" And the Prophet Ibrahim answers with one word. He says, "Yes." And then Hajar looks at him and he says, "If he told you to leave us, then go." And there's some of us here who are fathers, right? And some of us who will be fathers in the future, and some of us who have fathers. Try to put yourself in the situation that Ibrahim is in right now. He's taken his wife and his very young son, some scholars say or infant son, to a wilderness, and he's leaving them. There's no water, there's no people, he doesn't know what's going to happen to him. And now put yourself in the shoes of Hajar. Your husband is taking you to a wilderness and leaving you where there is no one, with a child, and walking away. The level of faith that these people had in Allah was so strong that they said, well, if Allah said it, then let it be. But you can really feel the pain. You can feel the pain in that one word answer that Ibrahim a.s. gave, and he said yes. And you can feel the pain in Hajar's response to that, which is then go. There's a dua in Surah Ibrahim, chapter 14, 35 to 37, where Prophet Ibrahim makes dua for his wife and son. And it's very heart-wrenching. It's a really heart-wrenching dua. He says, "O Lord, I've settled some of my descendants in this barren valley next to your sacred house so that they can, our Lord, establish prayer. So make some people sympathetic towards them. Supply them with fruit so that they can learn to be thankful." He's imploring his Lord, saying, I've left them here in this place that you've instructed me to leave them. Send some people to them that they may be helped. Give them some food so that they may be thankful to you. But that's all he's got. I'm touching on this story so that you kind of understand the genealogy that our Prophet ﷺ came from. There's an interesting verse in the Bible that a lot of Christians, me as a Christian, when I was a Christian, I was reading the Bible, I would read this passage and I didn't really connect to what this passage was about. But as a Muslim, when you read it, it'll come straight at you. It'll be in your face, and you'll know exactly what it means. This is from Psalms, and when we say Psalms, a lot of scholars believe that this was extracts or the leftovers of what Zabur was, the book that Prophet Dawood wrote, the poetry, the songs that he wrote in praise of Allah. In Psalms, in chapter 84, verses 5 to 6, there's a verse that says this: "Blessed is the man whose strength is in you, in whose heart are the ways of them who pass through the valley of Becca and make it a well." As soon as you hear that, you know who we're talking about, right? But as a Christian, when I was reading the Bible, I had no clue. It's very interesting now when you look back and you go back and you read this. Prophet Dawood was talking about Prophet Ishmael here, and he's saying, isn't it blessed of the person who is left in a barren land and can make a well out of that? Now, where we left off is now Hajar's left in the wilderness with Ishmael a.s. Prophet Ibrahim has walked away, and they're literally in the rock, hot sand, and this young child is shortly will die of thirst. And we know the story of how Hajar ran between Safa and Marwa, right? There's probably a lot of mothers here who can really relate to this. She's in a desperate situation. This is not a trade route. It's very unlikely anyone's going to come past this desert, but she doesn't give up. She's still running between Safa and Marwa. Now, do you have any idea how far the distance is between Safa and Marwa? If you've done Umrah, you know it's far because it's tiring, very tiring. It's about 7 kilometers, roughly, between Safa and Marwa. She ran 3 times. It's about 22 kilometers now. She's run. And when we do it, if you've been to Umrah, it's a covered space, there's tiles, and there's air conditioning, and it's still very hard. During Hajj's time, it was just rock, sand, sun, and there's an infant child that she's leaving as she runs 7 kilometers away from him to go up to a mountain, and then runs back to him 7 kilometers. This is the real story of the strength of motherhood and how much a mom would do to try and keep their child alive. And we're going to see this sort of strength that women have in the Prophet ﷺ's life many times, many times. And we'll get to that as we get to those points. And we know the story as when she comes to Ismail alayhi salam has kicked the sand and there's a well, and this well is the Well of Zamzam. This Well of Zamzam becomes a very important focal point going forward. After the Well of Zamzam was created, the Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam lived approximately 75 years after that. And during his time, he would come and visit Ismail alayhi salam. And it was during one of those visits that he was instructed to build the Kaaba. Now, if you look in the Bible, there's a lot of references to Mecca, but it's referred to as Becca. The Psalms that I mentioned before is one of them. Right? The Kaaba is built during one of the visits that Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam was visiting Ishmael. And the pilgrimage is established. And it's in Surah Al-Hajj, chapter 22, verse 26 to 28. Now, around the area that Hajar and Ishmael were left was a tribe by the name of Juhram. Now we're starting to go into the history of the Arab tribes that lived in Mecca. There was a tribe called the Juhram. Now the Juhrams were, again, one of the pure tribes, one of the Kahlan tribes that came from the empire of Sheba and then spread out. And as they spread out and they separated, one tribe by the name of Juhram settled in this valley of Mecca or Becca. When the well sprung up and they saw that there was a well, obviously because they wanted water, they came to that valley and they saw Hajar there with Ishmael. And they asked Hajar permission to settle in that land, and Hajar agreed. So the Juhram tribe settles in the valley of Becca. And Ishmael grows up and he marries the daughter of the chieftain of the Juhram tribes. So here we see the two Arab categories, the Arabized Arabs and the pure Arabs are starting to mix. Ishmael marries this chieftain's daughter, and he has 12 sons. One of the 12 sons was by the name of Nabat. The descendants of Nabat created the Nabataean Empire. Anyone know the Nabataean Empire? Does that ring a bell? Jordan, Petra. If you go to Petra, the Nabataean Empire, it was the descendants of Ishmael's son Nabat that built that massive empire that actually rivaled the Romans at one point. Another son by the name of Kida had a descendant by the name of Adnan. And it was the Adnan descendants who were the Arabs that then settled in Mecca. And of those Adnanian Arabs was the Quraysh. You see why I've kind of gone all the way back and now we're heading towards where we're going? So even during the Prophet's time, when you said Arab, it wasn't straightforward. It wasn't just, Arabic-speaking descendants. It was a mixed bag. It was a big mix, as any ethnicity is nowadays. Now, the tribe of Juhram settled around the Well of Zamzam, and slowly they got larger and larger, and other tribes started coming, because wherever there's water in the desert, these tribes get attracted. So they all started coming to the Valley of Mecca and started settling around Zamzam. The tribe of Juhram continued to be the ruling tribe. But the other tribes weren't very happy with them. They started extorting money. They started persecuting the other tribes. They started becoming tyrannical. And so the other tribes that had now settled in Mecca began a revolt. They revolted against the tribe of Juhram, and they were helped by a tribe by the name of Quza. The Quza tribe, and with the help of the other tribes, overthrew the Juhrams. Now, when the Juhram tribe was overthrown, they did one thing. Before they ran away, they went to the Well of Zamzam and they destroyed it. They filled it up, and there was a legend just during the Prophet before Prophet actually, it's time, but a few generations before, there was a legend that the Juhram tribe actually hid their gold in there. But what they did do was that they put soil into it and completely destroyed the well. Now, the Quza tribe, though, weren't any better. They were just as tyrannical and just as ruthless to all the other tribes that were there. And they also didn't care about the Zamzam well, because by this time they've started digging other wells in the region and they've managed to find water in other areas, so they didn't really care to find it. But we're going to get to a very interesting story in a few weeks, inshallah, of how the Zamzam was found again. And it's very unique and very interesting. But at this stage, we have now lost the Well of Zamzam. The Well of Zamzam that Ishmael kicked and it sprung up, now it's disappeared. And no one knows where it is. Now, for many, many generations, people were following the religion that Ibrahim and Ishmael established in the Valley of Mecca. And for many, many generations, the Jewish people, a lot of Jews were doing pilgrimage to the Kaaba. But there was a particular man by the name of Amr ibn Luay. He fell ill one day and he went to Syria to get treatment. And when he went to Syria, he saw all the people there worshipping a particular idol by the name of Hubal. And he thought, well, isn't this amazing? You know, these people are prosperous, they're doing really well. I should bring this idol and bring it back home. Amr ibn Luay is the first person to bring an idol to the Kaaba. And the Prophet ﷺ later narrates about how he saw Amr ibn Luay in the hellfire. This first idol, the Hubal idol that the people of Syria was worshipping, was brought and put into the Kaaba. And the Quran goes into a beautiful story about how, you know, people slowly transitioned away from the true religion. It's not, the corruption of a religion doesn't happen usually overnight. You know, the saying, the path to hell is paved with good intentions. This is what was happening. They start by saying, you know, there were such good people, we should remember them. We should remember where they sat, where they slept. And the next generation then says, you know, there's such good people, we should put something there to remember them. Let's put a stone. And then the next generation says, well, let's carve their figure into the stone. And then the next generation says, well, let's pay a lot of respect. And then respect becomes worship. This was what was happening to the Kaaba. To that region that Ishmael and Ibrahim built, the holy sacred valley that Jews were even doing pilgrimage to, has now starting to fall away because of the action of one man. And it's very interesting how the action of one man can do a lot of good, but how the action of one man can destroy and do a lot of harm for generations and generations and generations. We're now at the time of Prophet Isa, and the religion of Prophet Ibrahim in the region is barely noticeable. It's all non-existent. The Jews have stopped doing pilgrimage because they know that this has got corrupted. They are no longer coming into Mecca. A lot of Arab tribes that were there in the region, as the corruption was happening, left. So that's something to note as well. They left, and a lot of Arab tribes became Jewish. this is not a well-known fact, but there were a lot of Arab tribes in the Arabian Peninsula who were practicing the religion of Judaism because they felt that that was the closest thing to what Prophet Ibrahim had taught. But the tribes around the Arabian Peninsula and the tribes around the Kaaba have now, by at this stage, at the time of Isa, become completely polytheistic. Amongst these tribes, there was one man, and this man's name was Fihr, and his family was settled near the Kaaba. But Fihr also had a nickname. Anyone know what this nickname was? His nickname was Quraysh, and it was his descendants that become the Quraysh and the ruling tribes of that region. And we'll start next week, we're going to start going into the genealogy of the Prophet ﷺ, how from Quraysh, his descendants, and we can follow the linealogy from Quraysh all the way to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. But what we've done now is we've given the history of the Arabs. We've talked about the Prophet Ibrahim and how he established the valley of Becca and established the pilgrimage and established the Kaaba, and how very easily over generations, well, I won't say easily, but over generations, it has got corrupted to the point that it is completely polytheistic now. Does anyone have questions? I can't assure you I have the answers to everything, but if you have questions, I can try. No. All right, so we'll stop here because I don't want to go into the next stage, because the next stage is very, very important, where we're going to start learning about the genealogy of the Prophet. And perhaps next week or the week after is where we're going to start covering the birth of the Prophet. And that is very interesting in itself. What I'd like to recommend is, even if you know the Seerah, do try to come, because we start to go into those levels of depth and we try to understand the feelings and the emotions and the cultures and the backgrounds that these people lived in. So it's not just about the story, like I said when I started. All right, thank you everyone. The Arabized and the pure Arabs. And it was interesting because even during the Prophet's time, they had this view that there were different categories of Arabs. They don't have that now, obviously, because all Arabs are mixed now. It's impossible to find the distinction. And nearly all Arabs have descendancy of Prophet Ishmael alayhi salam.
What was the name of one of the descendants of Prophet Ibrahim?
Prophet Ishmael?
No, not that. The one after Prophet Ishmael. The one who...
Nabat.
Yeah, Nabat.
Nabat. And his descendants were the Nabataean Empire.
Yeah, Nabataean Empire.
I didn't touch on that, but it is an interesting story. What Brother Ashraf was talking about was a story of when Ibrahim was visiting Ishmael one time. And he came to the house where Ishmael wasn't at home. And his wife was there, and he said, where's your husband? And his wife, suddenly started spewing out all these things about he's never at home, you can never find him, he never helps me, he's never blah, 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 blah. And Prophet Ibrahim said, okay. And he walked away, and then he came back, and Prophet Ishmael was there, and he told Prophet Ishmael, you should change your doorstep. And he just said that, and Prophet Ishmael understood to say, oh, he's not liking my wife. He's suggesting that I divorce my wife. Later, Prophet Ishmael had another wife, and the same thing happened, but this time Prophet Ibrahim, when he visited Prophet Ishmael's wife, actually said a lot of positive things about him and said, yes, he works hard, yes, he's not here, but he always helps, he does his best. And Prophet Ibrahim comes back, and when he meets Ishmael, says, you should keep the doorstep that you have. And scholars say the doorstep is a reference to the entrance of the house, the backbone of the house. But that's an interesting side story. Correct. It is a view that the Jews hold. But it is a view that a lot of Jewish, you have to be Jewish is not only a religion, but it's also an ethnicity. You have to be born, this is the Orthodox view. That didn't stop Arabs from practicing Judaism though. I don't know if Jews of ethnic heritage of Judaism would have accepted them, I don't know. But we do know is that a lot of Arabs were practicing. Even nowadays, you know, you'd find dark-skinned Arabs, no, sorry, dark-skinned Jews to this day. So, correct. And I think, I don't know much about Judaism, but I believe that there are different sects in Judaism that accept converts and others that don't. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Hmm. That's right. And a lot of Jewish tribes settled in Europe because of that, because for many, many years in Christianity, dealing with interest was not allowed. So the only people who were running the banks and interest were the Jewish people. So the Jewish people settled to run the banks for the Europeans. It was later that Europeans, you know, started dealing with interest itself. But it's also an interesting fact that, you know, when you say Jewish, we think, we have a view in our mind, but you get people of Jewish descent, blue eyes, blonde hair, Russian looking, and you also have very dark-skinned Jewish. And it's similar with Arabs. It's an interesting thing that, you know, we're touching on we're trying to categorize people because it's easier for us to understand. But one thing which we have to be very, very clear is that the distinction of race or the treatment of people based on race in Islam is completely haram. Completely haram. And it is a very sad point that a lot of Islamic countries do practice racism directly or indirectly. But there is a story, and I'll touch on this because we have a bit of time, where a Sahaba once had a fight with Bilal. And the Sahaba, the famous Bilal. And he got so angry with Bilal, he said, "You're nothing but a black man." Bilal went to the Prophet ﷺ and said, "This was what this Sahaba told him." I've forgotten the Sahaba's name. And the Prophet ﷺ, we know, you'll learn this when we go through this, but the Prophet ﷺ, you could tell when he's angry because he had a vein on his forehead. And the vein would bulge. When he's really angry, the vein would bulge out of his forehead. And when he heard this, his vein bulged, and he said, "Call that Sahaba." And the Sahaba came and he said, "Do you not know that I am the son of a white woman and the son of a black woman?" Do you know what that means? Do you know what he was referring to? The white woman he was referring to was his wife Amina, his mother Amina. But the black woman he was referring to was Baraka, the slave who was looking after the Prophet Muhammad when Amina passed away. Amina passed away, it's a very sad story, we'll cover it, but I'll tell you briefly, in a very sad situation. They were coming back from Medina, in the middle of the desert she passed away. And this child was then left with Baraka. And Baraka looked after him and was a mother to him. And Baraka outlived the Prophet ﷺ. She lived for a very long time. But the Prophet loved him. And so when racism and skin color is brought, it is a personal attack for the Prophet ﷺ. He personally takes it and he personally gets very angry about it. And that's something that we have to remember. Racism should not go anywhere near Islam. It cannot happen. It's impossible. And unfortunately it does, but we have to remember that whenever you hear it, you have to feel the same anger that the Prophet ﷺ felt. And when the Sahaba heard this, he put his head on the ground and said, "Oh Bilal, please step on my neck because I'm so ashamed." That's the intensity of the Prophet's view towards racism, and I think we should really hold that. Yeah.